speaking of reading, when we had your webinar a couple nights ago or last week, you talked about the obstacles for effective reading. You talked about lack of education, lack of focus. You talked about regression, which I tend to do sometimes, which is like back skipping. You talked about limiting beliefs, but you also talked about that internal voice in your head, how when you use that internal voice in your head, you can only read as fast as that voice can go. And so Grace wants to know, how do you read without hearing your internal voice in your head?
Great question, Grace. Great question. So these obstacles to effective reading, right? And effective reading I define as, reading speed and reading comprehension. Because it doesn't, as we talked about, it doesn't make sense to have one without the other. There's a Woody Allen quote that says, I took a speed reading course, I read War and Peace. It's about Russia. And that's not like an 800-page book and just come out with Russia. And that's the misnomer and the myth about speed reading. And so, the regression and lack of education and limiting beliefs keep you from reading fast. But the big one is something called subvocalization. Subvocalization. And if you break down the word, vocal means speech. Sub means like inner, like a submarine. It's your inner speech. So if you ever notice when you're reading something, you hear that inner voice inside reading along with you. Hopefully it's your own voice. It's not like somebody else's voice. That's your subvocalization. And so for people who are listening, what Grace is asking is how do you get rid of that inner voice? Because it keeps you from reading faster. Because if you have to say the words, you can only read as fast as you could speak. That means your reading speed is limited to your talking speed and not your thinking speed. And there's a big, big difference. So the average person reads about 200 to 250 words per minute, like typing. It's done in words per minute. But you're capable of thinking many times more than that. And so the reason why a lot of people get distracted is because you're only reading 200 to 250 words a minute. That's leaving, imagine you're leaving 500 or 600 words per minute out that you could be processing. And since you're not giving your brain the entertainment it needs, it seeks stimulus elsewhere in the form of distraction, in the form of mind wandering. So if you have trouble focusing, one of the reasons why is because you're reading too slowly, is if you don't speed up and you feed your brain one word at a time, you're going to bore your brain, and that's why it gets distracted. And that's, again, your right brain, And so what we teach is a whole brain reading method. So left brain, as you know from high school biology, and this is a gross simplification, but it's kind of, a nice metaphor. Your left side deals with logic, with words, with sounds. It's very linear. And if your left side is logical, your right side is creative. It's imagination, it's emotions, it's visual and such. And so we want to make reading more of a right brain or a more whole brain experience where you're not just saying the words, on the left side, but you're experiencing the words, you're imagining, you're visualizing, you're creating it, you're feeling it on your right side. And so, subvocalization, let me say first, you'll always subvocalize to some level. Even myself, I subvocalize some words. And here's the thing. Do you need to say the words in order to understand the words? Do you need to say a word like computer to actually understand what a computer is? You don't, right? Just like a stop sign. You don't look at a stop sign and say, everyone you're driving, stop, stop. Say it to yourself, right? But do you understand what it means? Of course, because they call those words sight words, S-I-G-H-T. Those are words you know by sight. And 95% of all words you probably come across in a day through your books, through your newspapers, through your emails, on your websites, on the blog, are sight words. So you don't have to pronounce them. So how do you get rid of that voice? Part of it has to do with training, okay? So training and especially if you're doing whole brain training, meaning that you're activating your right side of your brain, so you're experiencing the words. So because a word is worth what? A picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So if you think in picture, that's like 1,000 words, right? And so we want to move in order to get to reducing subvocalization, more in the right side of your brain. Now, part of it has to do with training. So what we do is we have this online program where we're doing these speed drills, and we're doing very specific speed drills where I'm showing you how to hold the book, to how to, using, visual aids to be able to read and be able to time you. And just like you're working out, what was once hard becomes easy. So you could go and you could try to bench press something and let's say you're starting at 135 and it feels really, really heavy, but after you start doing it for a few weeks, it starts to become, your muscles grow, and then what was once hard, becomes easy, and you can kind of grow it. So I take people through a number of what I call push-ups, where they're pushing up at a certain pace, reading very fast, going back down, and when they go back down, it's not quite as slow as the first time. And then what happens is you naturally start creating these shortcuts, so that as you force yourself to read faster, what will happen is you stop saying words like the, and, there, because, of, like all these kind of filler words. You start reducing those at first. And then, the only words you start pronouncing really are those words that are more technical, those words like names, words that you haven't seen before. But I'll say this, though, and I'll give you a couple other tips, is that I don't read everything at the same pace. If I could read something, for example, at 1,000 words per minute, or somebody graduates our program reading 1,000 words per minute, which is 5 times normal, what they've started with maybe, they don't read everything in 1,000 words per minute. Like I don't speak French, so I can't speed read French, right? So you could only read as fast as you could understand the information. That's why when we do programs, we focus on speed reading, but I spend more time actually teaching smart reading, the kind of skills, because think about the last time we took a reading class, we were probably 8 years old, but has the amount of information you need to read increased a little bit, and has the difficulty increased a little bit, but how we read it is exactly the same, one word at a time, as when we're 8. So I would say the number one way of increasing your reducing your subvocalization are, speed reading drills that are engaging your right brain, and you're doing these right brain exercises to tap into your imagination. Let me give you a specific example. When I learned these skills, I went, a bunch of friends were going to go see a movie with Tom Cruise. He played a lawyer for the mob, and it was called The Firm, right? And I didn't read the book yet, and I bought the book, and I was like, oh no, I want to read the book first. And then they're like, well, let's go see the movie. And I was like, I went out with them, but before I left, I grabbed the book on the way out. And then we get to the theater, they're like, should we buy you tickets? And they're like, you know what, I'm going to start this book. And they're like, oh, that's fine, geek. They go see the movie, and I start my book. And I finish the book, and, a little while later, they come out of the movie, and I was like, how's the movie? And they're like, the movie's okay. And they were like, how's the book? I was like, the book was really awesome, because, even George Lucas and all those people at Pixar, they can't do what you could do inside your mind when you're really activating it. And so, I had another student that I'd met on this, I saw him on the street 3 years later. And when we practice, in these online programs, I let people choose their own stuff. And so they could pick any book they want to read. So it doesn't take extra time. They're just practicing in the stuff they need to read anyway. And he stopped me on the street and says, Jim, I have a story for you. I went to your program 3 years ago, and the book I was reading, I reread it recently, and it's totally different. And I was like, wow, that's cool. What's the book? And he said it was The Old Man and the Sea. The Old Man and the Sea. I was like, oh, that's cool, Hemingway. I was like, but how is it different? I don't think he updated the book recently. He was like, yeah, but after I went through your program, I reread it. I felt like I was in the book. I was like, he said, I could feel the sand beneath my feet. I could hear the ocean waves. He said the one thing I didn't like was the smell of the fish. And that's a true story, but that's what happens. And you know this, when you're really into something, your whole brain is light up, and that's what your imagination could do. And so as you're doing more of that, you're picturing it, you're visualizing it, you're not saying the words, as much. But a couple of kind of quick tips you could use. I mean, they're not really sustainable, but something you could do to be able to lower it. There's different techniques. Some people will say, bite your knuckles while you read. I personally don't think it's very sanitary, but some people, they'll use their mouth. They'll actually kind of mouth the words as they read silently. And so some people say if you bite your knuckles, you won't do that, and it'll interrupt that pattern. So you could try that. One of the other techniques people say to do is while you're reading, count to yourself silently. So as you're reading, you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. And the idea behind it is if you're saying the numbers, you can't be also saying the words. And, that also, and see if that's, that works for you, as well.